Crooked Creek, Minnesota, December 1891. The cold had already taken 3 barns and 1 church roof by the time anyone noticed what Solveig Aanstad was building into the side of her hill. Crooked Creek sat in a fold of prairie land where the wind had nothing to slow it down for 40 miles, and that winter it came early, and it came like it intended to stay. Families burned through their woodpiles by Christmas. Men rationed kerosene and prayed for a thaw that wasn't coming. At the western edge of the settlement, past the last timber cabin and into the slope of a low hill nobody had wanted, something different was happening. From the road, it looked like nothing at all, a mound of disturbed earth, a low door cut into the hillside, the kind of structure a man might dig for storing turnips. People rode past it and didn't slow down. But inside, something no one in Crooked Creek expected was taking shape. Solveig Aanstad was 73 years old. She had crossed from Trøndelag, Norway, 46 years earlier, and she had buried a husband in Minnesota soil 9 winters before this one. They stopped believing she would last the season on November 30th, 1891, the day the first hard frost cracked the water troughs from Crooked Creek to the Bergstrom claim 3 miles north. Her husband, Lars Aanstad, had died in October of 1882, crushed beneath a felled oak he was clearing for a new pasture fence. He left her with 2 children still at home, Inga, 11, and Marit, 8, a debt of $340 owed to the land office, and a winter approaching with no man's wages coming in. By 1891, both children were grown and gone. Inga to a logging camp near Duluth, Marit married into a farm outside St. Cloud, and Solveig was alone on the claim with nothing left to lose but the ground itself. Her position in Crooked Creek was about as low as a woman in that decade could occupy. A widow, foreign-born, old enough that most assumed her useful years were behind her. The town's unspoken expectation was that she'd sell the claim for whatever the land office offered and move in with one of her children. Failing that, she'd accept charity from the church poor fund, as 2 other widows already had that decade. Nobody expected her to stay through another Minnesota winter alone, let alone to start digging into a hillside in October with a shovel and a borrowed mule. Bjorn Halvorsen at the Mercantile told 3 separate customers that the old woman had lost her sense. The phrase followed her into town all that autumn. There goes the woman who's lost her sense, digging herself a grave before the ground does it for her. What none of them knew was that Solveig's father had been a builder of Jordis back in Trøndelag, turf-roofed, earth-banked dwellings that Norwegian farmers had used for centuries in a country where timber was often scarcer than patience. She had grown up watching him cut sod in long ribbons, lay it root-side down over birch poles, and pack the walls with clay and stone until a structure breathed warmth back at a family no matter how the wind screamed outside. She remembered her grandmother saying that the earth never betrays you the way wood does. Wood splits, wood rots, wood burns. Earth only waits. Solveig had not built one of these dwellings herself in nearly 50 years, but she had not forgotten how. The morning she broke ground, 2 men from town happened to be riding past on their way to the Lindqvist place, and what they saw made them stop. The Townsend mining office had nothing to do with Crooked Creek's farmland, but Walter Townsend, the regional land commissioner, had business there anyway, collecting on 3 overdue claims before the snow made the roads impossible. He found Solveig outside the Lutheran church on a Sunday in late October, after services, in front of a dozen witnesses. With him stood Halvard Ekstrom, a man who had built 11 cabins in the county over 22 years and survived 19 Minnesota winters in timber frame homes of his own design. Ekstrom looked at the marked-out footprint of Solveig's dugout, 18 feet by 14, cut 3 feet down into the hillside, and shook his head before she'd laid a single stone. "You can't bank a roof with sod and expect it to hold past February," he told her, loud enough for the churchyard to hear. "The frost will heave that ceiling down on you. I've seen earth roofs in this county fail in their first hard winter every time because nobody here builds them right. You'll be back asking for a timber cabin loan by January." Townsend didn't bother with technical objections. He simply reminded her, in front of the same dozen witnesses, that her note on the claim was overdue by $22, and that the land office held the right to reassess unimproved or abandoned style dwellings as forfeit collateral come spring assessment. Solveig answered with 4 words, "I'll have your money." Then she turned, took the mule's lead rope from where Inga's old gelding was tied to the rail, and walked back toward the hill. Work began on the last Monday of October, and it did not stop for 6 weeks. The dugout was cut into a south-facing slope, 18 feet wide and 14 feet deep, with the back wall, the north wall, driven straight into the hillside itself, so the coldest direction had 3 feet of solid earth standing between the room and the open prairie before a single board was nailed. The ceiling stood just under 6 feet at its peak, low enough that Solveig had to duck through the entrance tunnel, a detail Ekstrom had mocked outright. But a low ceiling meant less air to heat, and less air to lose, and Solveig had learned that arithmetic from her father before she'd learned to read. She cut sod in long strips from the unplowed field behind the claim, root side down, and stacked it 3 layers thick over a roof frame of salvaged birch poles, the same poles Lars had cut years before for a fence he never finished. Beneath the sod went a layer of birch bark, peeled in sheets and overlapped like shingles, to keep moisture from working down into the poles. The walls below grade were faced with river rock hauled up from Crooked Creek itself. Packed with a clay mortar, she mixed by hand in a washtub, freezing her fingers to the wrist each time she worked it. The chimney she built short and squat, barely 2 feet above the roofline, angled so the prevailing northwest wind couldn't gut the draft and pull her heat straight up into the sky. The entrance tunnel ran 4 feet long and turned sharply at a right angle just inside the door, a cold trap that Lars's brother in the old country had once described in a letter, a detail meant to stop outside air from ever reaching the main room directly. By the second week, her hands had blistered, then split, then hardened into something closer to leather. A river rock slipped during the 3rd week and came down across her left thumb, blackening the nail to the bed. She wrapped it in a strip of flour sack and kept working. Her wool dress, the same one she'd worn through 6 winters, hung looser on her by November than it had in October. Her cheeks hollowed. She stopped commenting on the aches in her back because there were too many to name individually anymore, and her spine had taken on a permanent forward curve that would never fully straighten again, not in the 9 years she had left to live. Young Eric Solberg, the neighbor boy of 9, came by most afternoons to help haul sod on a sledge, a chore his mother allowed because it kept him out from underfoot. He never asked questions. He hauled, she stacked, and some afternoons she gave him a heel of bread for the work. In the 2nd week of November, Halvard Ekstrom's own cousin, a farmer named Otto Reierson, rode past the hillside and reined in to look at the half-finished mound. "Is that a root cellar?" he called out. "No," Solveig said, and kept laying sod. Otto waited a moment for more, got none, and rode on toward town without understanding what he'd seen. The first real test came on a clear night in the last week of November, when the thermometer nailed to the mercantile porch read 4 degrees above zero. Not the cruelest cold the season would offer, but cold enough to matter. Solveig lit a small fire in the dugout's squat stone hearth that evening, fed it 8 split logs, and let it burn down to coals before she slept. She'd asked Eric's mother, Astrid Solberg, to stop by the next morning, mostly so someone besides herself would know whether the walls had held through a freezing night. Astrid arrived a little after 8, expecting to find the old woman huddled under every blanket she owned. Instead, she found the dugout's low door already open to the morning air, Solveig outside hanging a single wash shawl on a line strung between 2 fence posts, steam rising faintly off the wet wool in the cold. Astrid ducked through the tunnel into the main room and stopped just past the right angle turn. She pressed her palm flat against the earthen wall near the hearth. It wasn't hot. It was simply warm, the way a stone feels in late afternoon sun, holding heat it had no obvious source for. She glanced at the cold, dead coals in the hearth, then back at the wall, confused by what her hand was telling her that her eyes said shouldn't be true. "It's only November," Solveig said. Nothing more. Astrid left without fully understanding what she'd touched. Winter had barely started. The real test was still coming, and both women, in their own ways, knew it. Before that test arrived, it's worth pausing on something. If you've made it this far, I'd like to know, what would you have done in Solveig's position, with a debt collector at your door and an expert telling you that you'd built your own coffin into a hillside? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. The real test arrived on the 9th of December. The first sign came a full day ahead of the worst of it, a strange stillness in the air on the 8th, the kind old-timers in Crooked Creek called the quiet before, when even the dogs went restless without explainable cause. By the morning of the 9th, the wind had begun rising out of the northwest in short, testing gusts. Then the temperature began to fall, and it fell fast, nearly 6 degrees an hour through the early afternoon, a rate steep enough that men checked their thermometers twice, assuming error. By 4 in the afternoon, the wind had stopped testing and started working in earnest, screaming low across the open fields and finding every gap in every wall in the settlement. The way it always found the weakness nobody had patched. Snow rode the wind sideways, not falling so much as hurled. By nightfall, the temperature outside Crooked Creek had reached 18 degrees below zero, with the wind dragging the felt cold down savagely further still. Halvard Ekstrom's cabin, built of solid-hewn timber and sealed for 19 winters of practice, registered 9 degrees above zero inside by midnight, and Ekstrom himself was up twice in the night feeding his stove, burning through nearly half a cord by morning, close to 18 logs in a single night. His wife would later tell a neighbor, just to hold off the worst of it. In Solveig's dugout that same night, the thermometer sheet hung near the door read 48 degrees above zero. Outside, 18 below. Inside, 48 above. A 66-degree difference between the two, and she had burned 11 logs the entire night to hold it. Ekstrom's cabin, 9 degrees, 18 logs. Solveig's dugout, 48 degrees, 11 logs. Out at the Lindqvist farm and across most of Crooked Creek, families pulled their mattresses down near the stove and slept in shifts to keep the fire fed through the worst hours. Solveig slept the night through, waking only once near 3 in the morning to add 2 more logs before returning to bed. The Bergstrom family, 3 miles north, had already burned through nearly 2/3 of their winter woodpile by the 9th of December, a pile meant to last into March, now thinning fast with the season barely begun. Solveig's entire woodpile that same week stood almost untouched, no more than a few dozen logs gone since October. The storm that began on the 9th did not end cleanly. It broke for half a day, then a second front rode in behind it on the 11th, colder than the first, and this was when the real danger arrived for Solveig, not from the cold itself, but from her well. Sometime on the morning of the 11th, the rope and bucket well at the edge of her claim froze solid to the bottom, the first time in 9 winters it had ever frozen completely through. With the second storm howling outside and travel impossible, she had no way to reach the Solberg place a half-mile off, and no way to know how long the freeze would hold. She made one decision that morning that frightened her more than anything since Lars died. She let the hearth fire burn all the way down to nothing, deliberately, in the early afternoon, to see, truly see, with no fire to mask the answer, whether the earth itself could hold the warmth on its own, the way her father always swore it would. She watched the thermometer by lamplight through the afternoon. 1 hour after the fire died, 41 degrees. 2 hours, 38. 3 hours, 36. Then it stopped falling and held there, steady, while the wind tore at the hillside above her and the temperature outside sat near 22 below zero. It was Eric, of all people, who found a way through the drifts late that afternoon, half against his mother's wishes, worried for the old woman alone on the hill. He pushed through the tunnel entrance, snow-caked to his coat, and found her sitting calmly by a cold hearth with a blanket over her knees. "Aren't you afraid the fire's out?" he asked her, breathless. "The ground doesn't go out," Solveig answered. "Only the fire does." "How do you know it'll hold?" "Because it already has." She relit the hearth that evening, more for him than for herself, and gave him bread and hot water with a little sugar stirred in before sending him back through the drifts with a lantern, the wind finally beginning, just slightly, to ease. The well thawed 2 days later, on its own, once the second front passed. The crisis resolved the way most of that winter's crises resolved for Solveig, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone but a 9-year-old boy ever knowing how close it had come. The second storm broke for good on the morning of the 14th of December, and Astrid Solberg, fearing the worst after 2 days without contact, walked the half-mile to the hillside expecting to find tragedy. She'd prepared herself for it the whole walk out. The dugout roof collapsed under snow load, or worse, no answer at the door at all. The drifts along the path stood waist-high in places, and she had to detour twice around fallen tree limbs that the wind had taken down. By the time she reached the rise above Solveig's claim, Her hands were numb inside her mittens, and her chest was tight with dread. What stopped her was the sight of Solveig outside, in the thin winter sun, pinning wet laundry to the line as though it were a mild October morning. Astrid stood frozen for a moment, genuinely unsure what she was seeing. Then she went to her, and Solveig only nodded toward the door, inviting her in without a word. Inside, Astrid removed her coat without thinking about it, the gesture automatic before her mind had caught up to why. She pressed her palm flat against the stone facing near the hearth, the way she had in November, except now the wall held a steadier, deeper warmth than before. She walked to the thermometer hanging by the door and read it aloud. 61, she said. Outside, the thermometer at the mercantile that same morning read 4 degrees below zero. That's warmer in here, Astrid said slowly, than my home with the stove burning all night long. Halvard Ekstrom arrived separately 3 days later, on the 17th, having heard from his cousin Otto that the old woman's place had come through the storm untouched, while 2 timber cabins in the county had lost roof sections to the snow load. He walked the dugout's length without a word, ran his hand along the sodden birch bark roofline from the inside, checked the angled chimney, and crouched to examine the river rock facing near the hearth. He straightened, looked at her, and said only, "I was wrong." Solveig nodded once, picked up the bucket she'd set down when he arrived, and went back to her work. That was the entire exchange. It was enough. The change in Crooked Creek did not come as a movement. It came one family at a time. The Reyersons came first, in late December, quietly asking Solveig to walk their claim with them before spring. Then the Halversons. Then, by February, a young couple newly arrived from Bergen who'd heard the story secondhand and sought her out directly, notebook in hand, asking her to explain the angle of the entrance tunnel and the thickness of the sod layers. Halvard Ekstrom himself became, by that same February, something closer to a student than a skeptic. He began bringing a small notebook of his own when he visited, asking about clay ratios and birch bark layering. And by the following autumn, he had built 2 earth-banked additions onto cabins of his own design, using methods he once swore would collapse under their own weight. Walter Townsend, the land commissioner, said nothing further about reassessing the claim. Solveig paid her $22 in January with money earned helping 2 neighboring families dig and face their own dugouts before the following winter, and the matter was simply never raised again. He had no results to point to, and results were the only currency that mattered in Crooked Creek by then. The numbers spoke for themselves, and people in the county liked numbers they could repeat to each other at church and at the mercantile. Ekstrom's cabin had burned 18 logs to hold 9 degrees on the worst night of December. Solveig's dugout had burned 11 logs to hold 48. The story, and the arithmetic behind it, spread north into the Red River Valley by the following winter, and a Norwegian-language newspaper in Minneapolis ran a short item on Jordis construction the next fall, crediting an unnamed widow near Crooked Creek with reviving a nearly forgotten method. Solveig lived another 9 years on that claim, in that same dugout, through 8 more Minnesota winters. She never took credit beyond what the results already spoke for, never lectured the families who came asking, and answered every question put to her plainly and without embellishment, the same way she always had. By the early 1900s, earth-banked and sod-roofed outbuildings had become common enough across parts of rural Minnesota and the Dakotas that few people building them still remembered where the practice had been revived. The Hillside dugout itself stood for decades after Solveig's death in 1900, slowly settling back into the slope it was cut from. Locals say the stone facing near where the hearth once stood was still visible as late as the 1950s, half buried in grass. Sometimes the difference between surviving a hard season and being broken by it has nothing to do with strength or pride, or even courage in the way people usually mean it. It is simply the willingness to trust a method everyone else has dismissed as old-fashioned, foreign, or beneath consideration, and to keep trusting it, quietly, long after the mocking has stopped and the proof has spoken for itself. If you want more forgotten stories of courage from the American frontier, consider subscribing. Stories like Solveig's rarely survive in any history book. They survive because someone, somewhere, decided they were worth telling again.